The crisp morning air filled Officer Miller's lungs as he drove through the quiet streets of Pine Grove City. The sun was just starting to peek through the clouds, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made him love his early shifts, where the world seemed to pause between night and day. As he turned his patrol car onto Oak Street, something caught his eye. There, on a weathered wooden bench in Memorial Park, lay a figure wrapped in what looked like an old army jacket. The officer had seen many similar scenes during his 15 years on the force, but something about this one made him slow down his car. He pulled over, the gravel crunching softly under his tires. The morning dew had settled on the grass, making his boots slightly damp as he stepped out of his vehicle. The park was empty except for a few early morning joggers in the distance and some birds searching for breakfast. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Miller called out, keeping his voice firm but gentle. The figure on the bench stirred slightly but didn't fully wake up. As he got closer, he noticed the jacket wasn't just any army jacket. It was a genuine military-issued piece, worn and faded, but still carrying the dignity of service. The man on the bench slowly sat up, his movements careful and deliberate. His face was weathered, like a map showing the journey of hard years, but his eyes held a clarity that caught Officer Miller off guard. Despite the man's disheveled appearance, there was something about his posture that spoke of discipline and training. "Good morning, officer," the man said, his voice carrying a strength that didn't match his current situation. He started to reach for something in his pocket, and Officer Miller instinctively tensed up. But what emerged was a worn military ID card, falling from the man's trembling fingers onto the dewy grass. As Officer Miller bent down to pick up the ID, he noticed the name, Thomas Davidson. The photo showed a younger version of the man before him, standing proud in his military uniform. The contrast between the image and the person sitting on the bench told a story that made the officer's heart heavy. "I know I'm not supposed to be sleeping here," Thomas said, running his hand through his gray-streaked hair. "Just needed to rest for a bit." His words were apologetic, but there was a dignity in how he held himself, even sitting on that park bench in the early morning light. Officer Miller found himself looking at his citation book, then back at Thomas. The morning breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet smell of nearby flowering bushes. A few more joggers passed by, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm on the concrete path. It was then that Thomas started to speak, his voice barely above a whisper at first. "You know, officer, 20 years ago, I never thought I'd be sitting on this bench talking to you." He paused, looking at the rising sun, its golden rays now spreading across the park. "I had a different life then." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Officer Miller could feel that this wasn't going to be a routine vagrancy call. Something in Thomas's eyes, in the way he spoke, told him this morning was about to become much more than just another patrol shift. The sound of chirping birds filled the silence between them, and in the distance, a church bell rang 6 times. Officer Miller looked at his watch, then back at Thomas. Protocol said one thing, but his instincts were pulling him in a different direction. He didn't know it yet, but his next decision would change not only this morning, but many mornings to come. Thomas shifted on the bench, making room at one end, an unconscious gesture of invitation. The morning light now fully illuminated his face, revealing eyes that had seen more than most people see in a lifetime. As Officer Miller stood there, the weight of his badge felt different somehow, like it was asking him to be more than just an enforcer of laws. The story that was about to unfold would prove that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as routine encounters, and that compassion can bridge gaps that rules and regulations cannot. But first, Officer Miller had to make a choice, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his role as a police officer. Taking a deep breath, Officer Miller made his decision. Instead of standing over Thomas, he sat down on the bench beside him. The old wood creaked slightly under their combined weight, a sound that somehow broke the tension in the air. Thomas straightened his jacket, a habit from his military days that hadn't left him even now. His fingers traced over the worn fabric, touching spots where medals once proudly hung. The morning light revealed patches that had been carefully sewn, speaking of someone who took pride in maintaining what little he had left. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Thomas said quietly, his eyes focused on something distant, something only he could see. Served with the 10th Mountain Division. Never thought I'd end up here, you know. He pulled out his military ID again, this time holding it carefully, like a precious photograph of better days. The ID showed a different man, one with bright eyes and a confident smile, standing tall in his dress uniform. The difference between that photo and the person sitting on the bench wasn't just about age or appearance. It was about something deeper, something that had changed inside. "We were the best of the best," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared his story. "Our unit was like family. Bobby from Texas with his terrible jokes that somehow made us laugh even on the worst days. Pete from Chicago who could cook up a feast from basic rations." His voice trailed off, and Officer Miller noticed how his hands had started trembling slightly. A jogger passed by, their footsteps fading into the background as Thomas's story unfolded. The morning had grown warmer, but Thomas seemed to shiver slightly as memories washed over him. Officer Miller noticed how he kept his back straight, maintaining that military bearing even as his voice wavered with emotion. "Back home, they give you a parade. People shake your hand. They call you a hero," Thomas said, looking down at his worn boots. "But they don't tell you about the silence. About how loud it gets when you're alone with your thoughts. About how hard it is to sleep in a quiet room when you're used to always being on alert." Officer Miller found himself leaning in, his citation book completely forgotten in his pocket. The morning traffic had started to pick up on the nearby street, but here in their corner of the park, time seemed to stand still. "Had a good job in construction after I got back," Thomas continued. "Own apartment, even started dating again. But the nightmares," he paused, taking a shaky breath. "They don't warn you about how the memories follow you home. How a car backfiring can send you right back there. How the smell of certain foods can freeze you in your tracks." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees above them, sending a few early autumn leaves dancing across their feet. Officer Miller noticed how Thomas tracked each moving leaf with his eyes, old habits of staying alert to everything around him. "Lost the job first," Thomas said, his voice matter-of-fact but heavy with unspoken pain. "Couldn't focus right, kept jumping at loud noises. The foreman, good guy, really tried to work with me, but construction sites are noisy places." He managed a small, sad smile. "The apartment went next, then the car. It's funny how fast things can unravel when the ground under your feet doesn't feel solid anymore." Officer Miller watched as Thomas absently adjusted his collar, another automatic gesture from his military days. The sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the park. More people were starting to arrive, early morning workers cutting through on their way to offices, parents pushing strollers, elderly couples taking their morning walks. "Yesterday was Bobby's birthday," Thomas said suddenly, his voice catching slightly. "Would have been 45 this year." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Officer Miller didn't need to ask what had happened to Bobby. The past tense and the look in Thomas's eyes told the story. A group of birds landed nearby, pecking at the ground for breakfast. Thomas watched them with the kind of intense focus that spoke of someone used to being aware of everything around them. His military training was still there, visible in every movement, every reaction. The story was far from over, but already Officer Miller could feel something shifting in his understanding. The badge on his chest certainly felt different, not just a symbol of authority, but a responsibility to see the human stories behind each encounter. As Thomas prepared to continue his story, the morning traffic hummed in the background, a reminder of a world that kept moving forward while some of its heroes struggled to find their place in it. The morning had grown warmer as Thomas gathered himself to continue his story. Officer Miller noticed how the veteran's shoulders tensed up, as if the weight of his memories was a physical burden he had to carry. The park around them had come alive with the sounds of the day, but in their small corner, time seemed to slow down. "You know what the hardest part is?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the big things. It's the little moments that catch you off guard." He rubbed his hands together, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place with his military bearing. "Like when you're in the grocery store and someone drops a can. The sound hits you, and suddenly you're not there anymore. You're back there." Officer Miller found himself unconsciously leaning forward, his training telling him to stay alert while his heart told him to listen. The morning sun had risen higher, casting dappled shadows through the leaves above them. A child's laugh rang out from somewhere in the park, making Thomas flinch slightly. 2 weeks ago, Thomas continued, I was at my job at the hardware store. Been there 8 months. Good people, patient with me." He paused, taking a deep breath. Someone knocked over a shelf of metal pipes. The sound. His hands started trembling again. Next thing I know, I'm on the floor, shouting at everyone to take cover. The look in people's eyes, that fear, that pity, it was too much. A delivery truck rumbled past on the nearby street, and both men instinctively tracked the sound. Officer Miller noticed how Thomas's eyes scanned the area, a habit born from years of staying alert in dangerous places. The similarity in their trained responses created an unspoken understanding between them. "Lost the job that day," Thomas said, his voice steadier now but filled with resignation. "Can't blame them, really. Who wants a guy who might drop to the ground screaming at any moment? My landlord was understanding at first, gave me extra time to find new work. But understanding doesn't pay the bills." He gestured to his worn backpack beside the bench. "Everything I own is in there now." The morning joggers had given way to people hurrying to work, their quick steps and coffee cups painting a picture of normal life that seemed worlds away from the story unfolding on the park bench. A few curious glances came their way. A police officer and a homeless veteran sitting together made an unusual sight. "The VA tries," Thomas said, answering the question Officer Miller hadn't asked. "But there's so many of us and the system, it's like trying to bail out an ocean with a teacup. You get appointments months away, paperwork that goes missing, promises that turn into more waiting." His voice held no anger, just a tired acceptance that made it somehow worse. Officer Miller watched as Thomas pulled out a small, worn photograph from his jacket pocket. The edges were frayed, but the image was clear. A group of soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling under a bright desert sun. Thomas's finger gently touched each face in the photo, a ritual that seemed both comforting and painful. "Sometimes I dream about them," he said softly. "Not the bad dreams, but good ones. Where we're all together again, laughing about Pete's horrible cooking or Bobby's endless stories about Texas." A small smile crossed his face, quickly replaced by a shadow of grief. "Then I wake up, and for a moment, just a moment, I forget they're gone. That second of forgetting, sometimes that hurts worse than remembering." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Thomas watched these patterns with intense focus, as if they held answers to questions he couldn't quite form. Officer Miller noticed how his posture had changed as he spoke, still military straight, but somehow less rigid, as if sharing his story had loosened something tight inside him. "You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this," Thomas said, finally turning to look directly at Officer Miller. "Truth is, I've been sitting on this bench every morning for the past week, watching people walk by. Hundreds of people, all busy with their lives. You're the first one who actually stopped to see me. Not just look at me, but see me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Officer Miller felt the weight of his badge again, but differently now, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the responsibility to see the humanity in every situation. As Thomas prepared to continue his story, both men knew that this morning was becoming something neither of them had expected. Officer Miller shifted on the bench, the morning sun now high enough to warm their faces. Something about Thomas's words had struck a deep chord within him. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small photo of his own, worn around the edges from frequent handling. "My brother," he said softly, showing Thomas the picture of a young man in desert camouflage. "He served too. Army, just like you." The officer's voice carried a weight that made Thomas look up sharply. "Never came home." The words hung in the air between them, creating a bridge of shared understanding. Thomas looked at the photo with the careful respect of someone who knew exactly what such memories meant. His hands, which had been trembling earlier, were steady as he held the picture. "You can tell a lot about a soldier from their eyes," he said quietly. "Your brother, he had kind eyes. The sort that would have watched out for his unit." Officer Miller nodded, swallowing hard. That's exactly who he was. Always putting others first. He carefully tucked the photo away. "That's why I became a cop, you know. Wanted to serve too, just in a different way." He looked around the park, now filling with morning activity. "But sometimes the uniform makes people forget we're human too." A group of pigeons landed nearby, pecking at scattered breadcrumbs. Both men watched them in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The birds' peaceful coexistence seemed to highlight the connection that had formed between these two men from different walks of life. "You know," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "in the military, they train us for everything. How to fight, how to survive, how to save lives." He paused, watching a leaf spiral down from above. "But they never quite figure out how to train us to come home, to live with the quiet, to face the memories that follow us like shadows." Officer Miller found himself removing his hat, setting it beside him on the bench. The gesture seemed to shift something in the air between them. No longer was this about an officer and a homeless veteran, but about two men sharing a moment of genuine human connection. "Last night," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger, "I had this dream. I was back home, in my old house. Everything was just as it used to be. Pictures on the walls, coffee pot bubbling in the kitchen, my wife's garden visible through the window." He smiled sadly. "Even in the dream, I knew it wasn't real. But for those few moments, it felt like peace." A young family walked past their bench, a small child waving cheerfully at both men. They'd both waved back, and for a moment, Thomas's face lit up with a glimpse of his younger self. "Kids," he said softly, "they don't judge. They just see people. Sometimes I think we adults forget how to do that." Officer Miller nodded, thinking about all the times his badge had created an instant barrier between him and others. "It's funny," he said, "how we put on these uniforms thinking they'll help us serve better, but sometimes they end up building walls instead of bridges." The morning had grown busier around them, but their corner of the park remained somewhat separate from the rush of daily life. A gentle breeze carried the scent of nearby flowering bushes, creating a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "You know what I miss most?" Thomas asked, straightening his jacket out of habit. "Not the house or the job or even the regular meals. I miss feeling like I belong somewhere. In the military, you're part of something bigger than yourself. Out here," he gestured vaguely at the park around them, "out here, it's easy to feel invisible." Officer Miller watched as Thomas's hands moved to his collar, adjusting it with military precision despite its worn condition. These small gestures of dignity, maintained even in the hardest circumstances, spoke volumes about the man's character. "When I first saw you this morning," Officer Miller admitted, "I was running on autopilot. Another homeless person in the park, another citation to write." He shook his head slowly. "Sometimes we get so caught up in following procedures that we forget to follow our hearts." A nearby church bell chimed the hour, its deep tones rolling across the park. Both men instinctively sat up straighter, years of training making them alert to any change in their environment. The shared reaction made them exchange a knowing look, a small smile of recognition passing between them. The story was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted in their interaction. The badge and the circumstances that had brought them together were no longer the most important things about this morning. What mattered now was the simple, powerful act of two human beings truly seeing and hearing each other. Thomas took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The morning had grown warmer, but a shadow passed over his face as he prepared to share the hardest part of his story. Officer Miller remained quietly attentive, sensing they were approaching the heart of what had brought this decorated veteran to a park bench. "It was supposed to be a routine patrol," Thomas began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "The kind we'd done 100 times before. Clear skies, quiet morning, just like today." He paused, his eyes focused on something far beyond the park's peaceful scenery. "We'd gotten reports of activity in a small village. Nothing unusual. We'd check it out, talk to the locals, show presence." A delivery truck rumbled past on the nearby street, and Thomas paused until the sound faded away. Officer Miller noticed how the veteran's hands had stopped trembling. Sometimes the hardest stories came with an unnatural calm. Pete was driving that day. Bobby was on point, scanning the road ahead. I was in the back, along with 2 new guys fresh from training. Thomas's voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the memory. We were talking about Pete's daughter's birthday coming up. He had this little pink teddy bear tucked in his vest pocket, something he'd carried through the whole tour to give her when he got home. The morning sun had climbed higher, but Thomas seemed to be feeling a different kind of heat as he spoke. The first explosion caught the front of our vehicle. Before we could even react, the second one hit the side. The world just, he spread his hands apart slowly, came apart. Officer Miller found himself holding his breath, the sounds of the park fading into background as Thomas's story pulled them both into that distant moment. A jogger passed by, her footsteps on the path seeming oddly loud in the quiet that had settled between them. I don't remember much of what happened next. Training kicks in, you know? You move without thinking. Thomas's fingers traced invisible patterns on his worn jeans. I got the new guys out first. They were closest to my position. When I went back for Bobby and Pete, his voice finally cracked, just slightly. The teddy bear was lying in the road. Pink fur turned gray with dust. Still clean somehow, not a spot of blood on it. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, creating dancing shadows on the ground. Thomas watched these shadows, using them to anchor himself in the present moment. We lost them both that day. Pete never made it home for his daughter's birthday. Bobby never got to tell more of his Texas stories. Officer Miller noticed how Thomas's military bearing had softened slightly, as if sharing this burden had physically lightened something inside him. The medals they gave us afterward, they feel heavy, like they're made from all the moments our friends will never have. The park had grown busier around them, but their bench remained in its own quiet bubble of understanding. A child's laughter floated over from the playground, making Thomas smile sadly. You know what's strange? Sometimes I'll hear a laugh like that, and for a split second, I'll remember Pete talking about his little girl. Good memories, but they hurt too. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of metal, a military challenge coin. Our unit's coin, he explained, turning it over in his hands. Pete gave me his the day before, said it was for luck. He held it out for Officer Miller to see, the unit's insignia still visible despite years of handling. When I got back home, Thomas continued, carefully returning the coin to his pocket, everything looked different, sounded different, felt different. My wife tried to understand, but how do you explain jumping at car doors slamming? How do you tell someone you can't sleep because the quiet is too loud with memories? The morning traffic had picked up on the nearby street, creating a steady background hum. Thomas seemed to draw strength from the ordinary sounds of city life. The nightmares started first, then the panic attacks. Started drinking to quiet the memories. Lost my job, then my marriage, then everything else, one piece at a time. He looked directly at Officer Miller for the first time since beginning this part of his story. You know what the hardest part is? It's not the memories of that day. It's the feeling that you've let everyone down. The ones who didn't make it home would have wanted us to live full lives, to be happy. Instead, he gestured at his worn clothes and the backpack beside him. The church bells rang in the distance, marking another hour past. Both men sat in silence for a moment, letting the sound fade away. Thomas's story hung in the air between them, not just a tale of loss and struggle, but a testament to the hidden battles many veterans fight long after leaving the battlefield. Officer Miller looked down at the citation book in his pocket, then slowly pulled it out. Thomas watched, his face showing no surprise or protest. He'd been through this before. But instead of writing a ticket, the officer did something unexpected. He removed his badge, placing it carefully on top of the citation book beside him on the bench. You know, Officer Miller said, his voice softer than before, sometimes the uniform gets in the way of being human. He turned slightly to face Thomas more directly. Right now, I'm not here as a cop. I'm here as someone who sees you, really sees you. The simple gesture seemed to shift the whole atmosphere around their bench. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly, though years of military bearing kept his posture straight. The morning had fully bloomed around them, the park alive with the sounds of daily life. When my brother died, Officer Miller continued, his voice steady but gentle, I kept thinking about all the things he'd never get to do. All the birthdays, holidays, simple Sunday mornings he'd miss. He paused, watching a pair of birds hop across the path in front of them. But what hurt most was thinking about how many other soldiers might be out there, going through what he went through, feeling alone. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them. There's a lot of us out here, he said quietly. Some sleeping on benches like me, others in houses but just as lost. The uniform comes off, but the memories stay with you. Officer Miller reached into his other pocket and pulled out his phone. You know, I've got some numbers here, people who actually want to help. Not just the usual bureaucracy, but folks who understand. He started scrolling through his contacts. My brother's death, it pushed me to build connections, to find people and organizations that really get it. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. Thomas watched as a group of office workers hurried past, carrying their morning drinks. Funny how life goes on around us, he mused. All these people rushing to their jobs, their homes, their lives. Sometimes it feels like watching a movie you used to be part of. But you can be part of it again, Officer Miller said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. Not the same way as before. We both know things can't go back to how they were. But there's a place for you, Thomas. There's people who want to help you find it. Thomas smiled slightly, a mix of hope and skepticism in his expression. Been through the system before, officer. Lots of promises, lots of waiting rooms, lots of forms that lead nowhere. This is different, Officer Miller insisted, turning his phone screen towards Thomas. These are people I know personally. Veterans helping veterans. No red tape, no endless paperwork. Just people who've walked in your boots and found their way back. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the park. A group of children ran past, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Thomas watched them with a distant look in his eyes. You know what I miss most? Having a purpose. In the military, every day you knew what you were doing mattered. Now, it still matters, Officer Miller said firmly. Your story, your experience, it all matters. Maybe not in the same way as before, but it matters. He gestured to his badge, still lying on the citation book. You know what this badge really means. It's not about enforcing rules. It's about serving the community. And right now, my community includes you. Thomas looked at the badge, then at Officer Miller, seeing beyond the uniform to the person underneath. Your brother, he said softly, he'd be proud of how you're wearing that badge. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either man expected. Officer Miller felt his throat tighten slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. The morning traffic continued its steady rhythm on the nearby street, a reminder of the world moving forward around their moment of connection. So what do you say? Officer Miller asked, holding up his phone again. Instead of writing you a citation, how about we make a few calls? Right here, right now. No waiting, no maybe's, no next time. He paused, letting his words sink in. Sometimes the hardest part is just taking that first step. Thomas sat quietly for a moment, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. The park had grown busier around them, but their bench remained in its own bubble of possibility. The choice before him wasn't just about finding a place to sleep or getting a meal. It was about choosing to believe in hope again. Thomas took a deep breath, looking at the phone in Officer Miller's hand. It was just a simple device, but in that moment, it represented something much bigger. A bridge back to the world he'd lost touch with. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, warming the park bench they shared. You know, Thomas said slowly, I've had a lot of people offer help before. But there's something different about today. He looked at Officer Miller's badge, still lying on the citation book. Maybe it's because you took the time to listen, really listen. Officer Miller nodded, understanding the weight of this moment. He dialed a number, putting the phone on speaker. A friendly voice answered, belonging to another veteran who now ran a local support center. As they talked, Thomas's expression began to change, the hardness in his eyes softening just a bit. We've got space in our transitional housing program, the voice on the phone explained. It's not just a bed, it's a community. Veterans helping veterans. We've got counseling, job training, and most importantly, people who understand what you're going through. The conversation continued, each word building a foundation of possibility. Officer Miller watched as Thomas's military bearing slowly relaxed, hope cautiously replacing the resignation in his posture. They made arrangements for immediate temporary housing, with a promise of longer-term support to follow. This isn't charity, the voice on the phone assured Thomas. This is veterans taking care of their own, just like we did over there. Those words seemed to resonate deeply with Thomas, touching something that had been buried under years of struggle. As they finished the call, a small crowd of park visitors had gathered nearby, drawn by the unusual sight of a police officer and a homeless veteran engaged in such intense conversation. Among them was a local news reporter who'd been jogging through the park, her journalist's instinct telling her this was more than just a routine interaction. "Would you mind if I shared your story?" she asked, approaching them carefully. "People need to hear this, not just about the struggles veterans face, but about how a moment of compassion can change everything." Thomas looked at Officer Miller, who nodded encouragingly. "Maybe my story can help someone else," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe another veteran will hear it and know they're not alone." The reporter listened as they recounted their morning's conversation. She took notes about Thomas's service, his struggles, and the unexpected turning point that came from an officer who chose to see the person behind the circumstances. The story would later become a catalyst for change in their community. Within hours, Thomas had a safe place to sleep for the first time in weeks. The Veteran Support Center welcomed him with understanding and respect, not pity. Officer Miller drove him there himself, not in the back of his patrol car, but in the passenger seat, like a friend helping another friend. But the story didn't end there. The local police department, moved by what had happened, implemented new training programs focused on veteran interaction and support. Officer Miller became an instructor, sharing his experience to help other officers understand the importance of looking beyond the surface. Thomas, with stable housing and support, slowly began to rebuild his life. The nightmares didn't disappear, but he learned better ways to cope with them. He started volunteering at the Veteran Center, using his experience to help others who were walking the path he knew so well. "You know what Pate would say about all this?" Thomas asked Officer Miller when they met again months later. He was wearing clean clothes now, his military bearing complemented by a renewed sense of purpose. He'd say, sometimes the best battle plan is just showing up for each other. The park bench where they first met became known in the community. Other veterans would seek it out, knowing its story. Sometimes they'd find Officer Miller there during his breaks, ready to listen and help. Sometimes they'd find Thomas, now working as a peer counselor, sharing his journey from that bench to a new life. Their story spread beyond their city, inspiring other communities to look differently at the intersection of law enforcement and veteran support. It wasn't just about programs or policies, it was about the simple, powerful act of one human being truly seeing another. "The uniform can connect people just as much as it can divide them," Officer Miller would often say when telling their story. That morning, 2 different uniforms, one worn, one current, created a bridge instead of a barrier. As the years passed, that ordinary park bench remained a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. Thomas and Officer Miller's chance encounter had rippled outward, touching countless lives and proving that while the past can't be changed, the future is full of possibilities when people choose to see each other's humanity.